Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Cambridge Union Society. Once again, welcome to the third debate of Michaelmas term. The last year or so has been a turbulent one for the member states of the European Union. After the collapse first of the Constitutional Treaty and difficulty over the Lisbon Treaty, member states that finally tested in recent weeks, firstly over foreign policy questions with Russia, and more recently over coming together in order to solve financial questions. It's with these kind of questions, these tests and these crises in mind, we set the motion which stands before the House tonight, which is, this House believes that only integration can keep Europe strong. We've got a team of experts for you tonight to debate on both sides of the House. We have in proposition John Tomlinson, Charles Grant, Nick Butler and Hervé Marion. In opposition, Roger Natman, Daniel Hannan, David Campbell-Bannerman and Hugo Hadley. And without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome the leading proposer of the motion tonight. He's a live peer, he's the former Under-Secretary of State for the Foreign Office, is Lord Tomlinson. Welcome.
Well, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all thank you for the invitation and then begin by abusing the invitation by correcting you, Mr. President, because the motion is that this House believes that only greater integration, not integration, but greater integration can keep Europe strong. And that is an important distinction because I believe that we are not talking about that which we'll undoubtedly hear about from the opposition, about a great country called Europe. We are talking about greater integration within the framework of a Europe made up of sovereign member states. Europe's strength is multifaceted and depends on, inter alia, our economic performance, our foreign and security policy, our energy policy, our environment policy, our counter-terrorist policy, a strategy to combat organised crime, our neighbourhood policy, our capacity and willingness to combat global poverty together. All of those things are important, but additionally it depends on the efficiency and the effectiveness of the EU institutional arrangements to give proper effect to the development and implementations of policies in the common interest. Between us, the supporters of the resolution will cover many of these questions. But I start off with this: only greater integration. And I think it's important to emphasise again the phraseology of the motion. It is not total integration, but greater. It is relatively more integration, but not absolute, and we should always remember that the decisive factor in any increased integration depends on the determination of national governments, each subject to their own parliamentary scrutiny and their own decision-making, the dependence on them whether they should pool rather than surrender their sovereignty. So let us have no nonsense tonight from the opposition to the motion about creating a single European superstate. Let's have no nonsense about surrendering our sovereignty. What we are doing is pooling it in our own economic, political interest. Now, the UK, during the process, both of the convention, which led to the draft constitution which failed, and later in the Intergovernmental Conference, established very clearly the parameters within which it was prepared to engage with Europe, the so-called red lines. We had decided in advance those areas where integration was not appropriate, where we would defend our own self-interest, and so we have, in those Lisbon negotiations, a foreign policy system that remains intergovernmental, a tax and social security arrangements which are subject to voting by unanimity, and therefore in effect we have our veto. There is nothing in the Charter of Fundamental Rights which can be used by any court to strike down any item of United Kingdom law, and on all the questions of justice and home affairs, we have our opt-in, opt-out arrangements so that we can decide where we participate. Now, I've no doubt we'll be told by speakers from the other side that we're leaving our legal system under threat, and that is what's being constantly said by some of our opposition parties.
On a point of information, my lord, if it's such an attractive constitution, why not put it to the people in a referendum and let them decide?
Because it's not a constitution, and you should know that better than anybody else. It's an amending treaty. I mean, facts are facts, and whether you like them or not, that is the reality. And the promise for a referendum was made in the context of there being, a constitutional treaty. Following the referenda in France and in Holland, the constitutional treaty was not only by the United Kingdom, but by all member states declared to be dead. And then we went back to the normal system of amending treaties, the treaty changes that we'd had at the Maastricht Treaty, at the Amsterdam Treaty, at the Nice Treaty, which is approval or disapproval by vote in Parliament. And that was done, and in the House of Parliament that I represent, there was not a single amendment after 14 days of debate. So, as I was saying, our legal system is not under the threat, according to some opposition parties. It's very much in the circumstances that were described by the eminent professor of European law at this university, Professor Dashwood, when he said that we had a very solid safeguard. So, Mr. President, there's the world of difference between what we're proposing and, I say, this fantasy that will be conjured up, a country called Europe. All I would like to do is to make one quotation about that. The myth that we are threatened with a European superstate is still nourished in the conservative cul-de-sac. Certainly there are continental idealists who bitterly regret that it has faded away, but faded it has, as has been clear since Maastricht. Not my words, not any Labour politician's words, but the words of our former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd. So, Mr. President, we are now looking at the European institutions in the context of an amending treaty. The institutional debate is nearly concluded. Both Ireland and the 26 have some thinking to do. Institutionally, we have to make up our minds whether we want the changes that are now appropriate to a community of 27 member states, or whether we want the basis of a treaty that was formed when we had 6 member states. We had successive enlargements from 6 to 9 when we joined it, then to 10, then to 12, then to 15, then the big enlargement, 15 to 25, then the Bulgaria-Romania enlargement to 27. And here we are, still with...
Well, how do you have one-size-fits-all legislation for so many states?
But nobody's suggesting one-size-fits-all. I'm not suggesting a state called Europe. I'm suggesting that we pragmatically, when it is in our national and collective interest to pool our sovereignty, that's what we should do. And we will be stronger when we do it. So what I would like to make absolutely clear is that there are a number of changes that need to be made, a number of strengthenings that need to be put into place. Decision-making needs to change. Qualified majority voting must be extended. The size of the Commission needs to be reduced. The Council of Ministers needs to have a more direct leadership, and that is in the form that is in the amending treaty, with a more longer-term, senior politician as the figure. As the president of it. The European Parliament needs to be strengthened. In short, we need those areas, those aspects of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, the Lisbon Treaty, what does it actually do? I mean, it makes it quite clear that we have a Europe which is a Europe of conferred competencies. Europe starts off with no competence at all of its own. It has no autonomous power. It only has powers insofar as member states have chosen to confer them upon the European Union. And Article 3 of the new treaty shows where there is exclusive competence. It shows in Article 4 where there's shared competence. All that is laid out very clearly, and it makes it absolutely explicitly clear in the Intergovernmental Conference Declaration that competences not conferred upon the Union remain with the Member States. So we've got all those matters which I think safeguard our interest, but give us the opportunity to extend our influence collectively and therefore our strength in Europe. We have the possibility also, which I would have thought most of the opposing speakers would have welcomed in Article 50, to actually withdraw from the community if we want to, something we didn't have before. Mr. President, there are the policy issues. We're not going to deal with migration questions in an island called the United Kingdom. We need to have engagement with our European colleagues. We're not going to deal with terrorism and organised crime in the United Kingdom without the sort of leadership we're getting from the Prum Treaty, which allows member states both to share fingerprinting DNA evidence for purposes of law enforcement. There are all sorts of other areas that are particularly important, both to get the community right for ourselves and to meet the aspirations of those countries who want to join it in a future enlargement. Police and judicial authorities cooperate widely at the present time, and they have got greater opportunity of doing that within the framework of the European Union. Finally, the area which I think is particularly important is the willingness of the European Union to combine together to exercise strength in the world. The European Union now the largest contributor of aid from any multinational organisation in the world. We are the world's largest provider of aid. When you look at serious major political problems, such as the Middle East peace process, it is the European Union, with its 800 million, that is the biggest provider of aid to the process.
Would Lordship give way? What European money is this? Could this be British and German taxpayers' money given to the European Union?
See, that is the level to which the argument has to go down. We pay a contribution to the European Union for policies that we want. And that European Union budget is spent on the policies that we're pursuing.
On a point of information.
No, your point of information, if it's as phony as the last one, will be a So, in conclusion, I have to say that this money is being spent wisely, it's being spent in our interest, in your interest, and in the interest of a wider Europe. And I commend the motion to you that the more we integrate together on the things that are our common interest, then we will not only maintain our strength, but have the opportunity of expanding it in the interest of ourselves and the wider world. I commend the motion to you.
Opening the case for the opposition for us tonight, a speaker who was a prominent Conservative Member of Parliament for many years, who left to join and they've become leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, and remains a member of the European Parliament. Please welcome to open the case for the opposition tonight, Mr. Roger Neill.
Well, the motion has altered slightly since I made my notes here. Only greater integration. When you're talking about the European Union, great is spelt G-R-A-T-E. I think we're talking to a different motion. Only greater integration can keep Europe strong. There's no hint so far that, in fact, various treaties have been turned down by the member states. So what are we talking about greater integration? under the terms that you, the Europhiles, alone introduced. It should be dead. Not only dead once, but dead twice. And whereas if it's such a good idea, why can't we have a referendum so we can decide? I'm bound to say, this is all very well. You didn't introduce one single amendment, I think you said, in the House of the Lords in 14 days of debate. Was that what was said, I think?
No, can I just make it absolutely clear? In 14 days, we debated over 240 amendments. It was just that most of them were so absurd they didn't command a majority in the House of Lords.
Oh, right. Well, I'm sorry that the debate in the House of the Lords is so inadequate. And obviously, quite obviously, the boast that somehow the full rigours of the British parliamentary system have been gone through to push through without giving a referendum, sadly may apply to the Commons, but we're always assured that the House of Lords is a far superior institution when it comes to debate. And I'm sorry to learn if that's not so. If greater integration results in strong regional powers, as this motion suggests, then what the dickens happened in Yugoslavia? Or the USSR? I mean, they weren't short of greater integration, sometimes at the point of a gun. But no, they all came there, they all tried to be integrated, they all went in for this big-time politics, and they all came to grief. And secondly, I'd say, what is this about keeping Europe strong? Europe's not strong. The leaders of Europe are cowering. They can't give you a referendum because now they know if they did, you'd turn it down. Is that a strong position to start with? And even more of the same. And I know we've debated before, but I find it slightly arrogant to talk about more integration when you can't get through the amount of integration you've already been proposing. When 75% of our laws are made in Brussels. Not that we have, I'm afraid, too much say in it. 75% are made by the commissioners. How much more before we're actually ruled in Brussels? And you say, no, this is wild talk. I want briefly to look at just 3 of the words in this carefully crafted motion. The 3 words are Europe. Well, I don't think that actually we probably mean Europe. This is a constantly changing body with constantly changing borders, and therefore it ceased in many ways to be a geographical entity, thought to be Europe in some way, but it's a political project. So I think for Europe one really ought to look, and I think we ought to be able to reach agreement on this, at the European Union. I think Europe means Euroland, you're quite right. The EU is an empire in the making. Oh, I didn't say that. Mr. Barroso says that. Mr. Barroso says it's an empire in the making. The first non-imperial empire. So you didn't hear it here first, you heard it from Mr. Barroso. It's an empire, but it's a non-imperial one, and therefore you can all relax again. What it means... It's probably the best since they offered a prize of £40,000 for defining subsidiarity. That was done when I first entered Parliament in about 1988. Nobody's won the 40,000 yet. So that was Europe. Now I'd like to take the second word, integration. Well, we're already in the European Union centralised, uncompetitive, share world trade going down faster than anywhere else in the world, integrated, bureaucratic, nearly half the commissioners coming from former communist countries, so what level of debate there can one expect? All in all, the thinking of the 1950s. The regional groupings, the regional powers, was the thinking of the 1950s. Let me just take one example. Because time after time we hear from the proponents of all this that we need to have a European regional parliament because You know, environmental matters don't stop at national boundaries, do they? But they don't stop at European boundaries either. And instead of this 1950s thinking, we found out, especially in the last few weeks, that certain problems are global problems. And they'll have to be solved globally. The third word I want to just discuss with you briefly is the word strong. What sort of strength is this we're talking about? Is it political strength? Is it defence capability? I hope it's not financial stability after the last few weeks. Or is it the environmental concern to which I've already alluded? Now, one thing about political institutions you can be darn certain is that power tends to move to the centre. It doesn't move away from the centre to the periphery, but to the centre. Now, I've already mentioned that some 75% of our laws are made in Brussels. And if you want to be ruled and governed in that way by unelected commissioners, so be it. I fear that we haven't really noticed the extent to which our government has been subcontracted to the European Union. Subcontracted without even the benefit of your support by way of referendum. Now, we can measure strength. Fortunately, in this amended now, only greater integration can keep Europe strong. Because we have some countries which until recently were integrated. We've got two types of countries in the European Union. The integration and the integrationists, the people who've been integrated, are such live wire economies as Bulgaria, Romania, the Czech Republic, Albania. They know all about integration.
Albania.
They've been...
Albania.
Albania is a socialist country and therefore knows very well, full well about the integration.
Just on a point of information, the leader of Albania, the Prime Minister, was a former Conservative member of the Council of Europe and sat as a partner with the Conservative group in the Council of Europe.
Then I'm jolly glad I'm a member of the UK Independence Party.
And that makes a lie true, does it?
If anybody thinks that the countries such as Albania, Bulgaria, Romania and all the rest, which for so many years were governed by and within the USSR, have in some way more to offer than the countries which are independent, especially Great Britain, and through Great Britain's efforts, those countries which also attained independence, then I say to you, look carefully at this motion, because it is the free countries where the greater integration will not keep Europe strong.
I'd just like to point out to the House that Albania is not a member of the European Union.
Exactly.
And I would say that I did not suggest it was. I said the countries in Eastern Europe, the countries in Eastern Europe which know about the USSR, which have been essentially behind the Iron Curtain, or been deeply socialist, they know all about this business of integration, and they have precious little to offer as a result. Now, I want, if I may take any more interventions, because I only have 1 minute left. I much prefer an American quote, President Jefferson. Any nation which gives up its freedom in pursuit of economic advantage deserves to lose both. That is what we've done. We've been darn careless, we've subcontracted our government to Brussels, and we certainly won't have a strong Europe if they continue in this way described tonight, without saying to the people, you shall have your vote first. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Matlin very much indeed for his comments, and to continue the case for the proposition tonight. have a former journalist, European correspondent to Economist, a founding member of the Centre for European Reform, and an author of several works on international affairs and economics. Very fortunate to be able to welcome Mr. Charles Grant.
Thank you very much. I'd like to use the first 2 of my 10 minutes to just think about where the world is going in the long run. What kind of world are we moving into? We have a multipolar world emerging in which the West is not dominant. According to the figures I've seen, in 2030, as a percentage of world GDP, America, China and the EU will each have about 20%. India will have about 10%. That's quite obvious, this kind of multipolar world. What is not obvious is the kind of multipolar world. Is it going to be multilateral, with everybody accepting strong international institutions, rules, supporting the United Nations? Or will it be, in the contrary, a world based on balance of power politics, where might is right, where people push each other around? Now, most Europeans have a strong bias in favour of the multilateral future. What Americans, Russians and Chinese have in common is they're sometimes unilateralists, they're sometimes multilateralists. It depends what they think is their own immediate interest. One of the jobs for the European Union in the coming century is to help shape the world in a multilateral direction. But we can only do this if we're strong. And what do we need in order to be strong, in order to have influence in shaping the new world order that's emerging? We need, of course, a strong economy. We need our soft power, which we have, our support for the international rule of law, the fact that we have a stable political system that is admired by many people in other parts of the world, our strong civil society. But we also need to learn to speak with one voice in foreign policy, and we need to have a stronger defence, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. I think institutions, as John Tomlinson said, can help with foreign policy. At the moment we have this ridiculous rotating presidency, a different country takes over every 6 months. It's not effective. We have the different bureaucracies in Brussels, the Commission doing foreign policy, the Council of Ministers doing foreign policy. The Lisbon Treaty would overcome those divisions and create a more unified system, though still, of course, run by unanimity with no majority voting, no cession of national sovereignty, but a more efficient system. I'm in favour of the Lisbon Treaty, but I'm the first person to acknowledge that's not going to solve the problems. What you really need for a more effective single voice is the political will to make sure the EU countries act together. And I'm the first to acknowledge there have been successes and failures in foreign policy. It's a work in progress. Solana, the current foreign policy chief, was only appointed less than 10 years ago. There have been failures like on Iraq, where we were divided. On Russia, we haven't yet got effective policies. There have been successes too. People forget the civil war in Macedonia that was breaking out 6 or 7 years ago before Javier Solana, aided by George Robertson and NATO, went there, created a peace deal with no civil war. We've been quite effective in the Balkans most of the time. We've been modestly useful in the Middle East through our work in the Quartet. The real success has been the Iranian nuclear diplomacy. If there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, it's worrying about the Iranian nuclear program and the fact that America or possibly Israel could attack Iran. The EU diplomacy has been a successful process so far. The outcome hasn't been successful, but the process has been successful, keeping the diplomacy going. The Americans and the Chinese and the Russians are supporting this diplomacy. It's the only game in town. That's an example of how we can be influential when we work together. On defence, let's remember why we have an EU role in defence. In the 90s, the Balkans were at war, and we kept on issuing statements telling Milosevic to do this or do that. He took no notice of us. We didn't have any battalions of troops. We do need a European defence capability because the Americans are not always going to be around sorting out problems in our own backyard, and because the EU can do something NATO can't do. It can bring together civilian and military capabilities, working together to try and solve problems on the ground. And again, as with foreign policy on defence, the verdict has been mixed. We've had successes. There have been 20 ESDP, that's European Security Policy, missions in various parts of the world. In Bosnia, peacekeepers are doing a good job today for the European Union. There have been policemen in Kosovo, there have been people policing the deal in Aceh in Indonesia and so on. Not very spectacular, quite boring stuff, but quite useful. I'm disappointed by the way European defence has developed. There should have been a better effort to boost military capabilities. It hasn't happened. The reality is only some European countries are serious about defence. In my view, they should go ahead on their own. What we do need, but the good news is that President Sarkozy is reintegrating France into NATO. This will overcome the division between NATO and the EU, this rather destructive division. The two organisations will now become much more integrated. They won't duplicate what each other do. This is a more effective way of getting NATO stronger and the EU stronger. And what we need to do now is spend more on defence in some countries because we don't have good enough military capabilities. And also, I should point out that Britain has always been the lead on European defence. Tony Blair invented it 10 years ago at the San Malo summit together with Chirac. And Britain will continue to lead in European defence because we're better at it than other countries. And it's all intergovernmental, no role for the Commission, no sovereignty ceded, governments working together, pursuing common objectives. My last word tonight is on Russia. Russia is, for me, the existential question for European foreign policy. If we cannot get effective policies on Russia, nobody is going to take us very seriously. For Britain, this is particularly important. We have big interests in Russia. Our oil companies have invested over $10 billion in Russia. If we have an argument between Russia and Britain, we're in quite a weak position. If there's an argument between Russia and Britain and we're part of a strong EU standing up for Britain, with Britain, we're in a much stronger position. That's why I'm very much in favour of integrating our policies towards Russia. We haven't, in the EU, done particularly well so far. Different EU countries think they have different interests, but there's some convergence, thanks to the departure of Chirac and Sarkozy, who were sycophantic towards Russia, thanks to the fact that the Russian recent threatening behaviour has created a certain solidarity amongst EU governments, and because there is a single market in energy emerging in Europe, which is beginning to create some common interests amongst us in our dealings with Russia, I think we're moving towards a more common policy. This is very important for Britain, as I said, because we are roughly in the middle of EU policy on Russia anyway. We're not sycophantic and we're not aggressive towards Russia as some EU countries are. So, to wind up on Russia, I think that the most important thing we should say to them is this. We cannot interfere with their domestic politics. If they don't want to be democratic, we can't really force them to be democratic progressively, but we can influence their foreign policy. And the EU, a strong, united EU, should say to Russia, if you interfere with the sovereignty, integrity, territorial independence of your neighbours, like Ukraine, then you'll pay a very heavy price, economic sanctions, restrictions on technology transfer and so on. I think the EU needs to move towards a common line on Russia. The truth is that everything I've said tonight is about intergovernmental cooperation. Federalism is dead. If you look at the 27 countries in the EU, only 3 of them are Belgium, Germany, Italy, have strong federalist tendencies, and the Prime Minister of Italy today is far from federalist. So the kind of spectres that the opposition tonight are conjuring up do not exist anymore. We've moved into an intergovernmental age, where strong nation-states working together, with Britain playing an important role in foreign and security policy, will set the agenda for the future. So I want to see a more integrated European foreign and defence policy. Thank you.
Speaker in opposition tonight is a Conservative member of the European Parliament, a journalist writing for the Telegraph. We're pleased to welcome Mr. Daniel Hannan.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'm conscious that I am the only Conservative on the lineup this evening, so before I go any further, are there any Russian oligarchs or former European trade commissioners present? But the only Conservative politician, I should have said. If so, identify yourself. If not, then I'll be able to talk freely. Who am I kidding? Like, anyone cares what an MEP thinks about anything. I suppose I should be grateful that, as a member of the European Parliament, I've been invited to address this illustrious society. I mean, you've got all these wonderful speakers coming. You've got, Jermaine Greer and Jude Law, and you've invited not one but 2 MEPs. We're not generally the most popular people in Britain. No, you don't have to rush forward and contradict me when I say that. I've become accustomed to this. I was elected, it's quite serious, I was elected on a turnout of 24% when I first became an MEP. More people voted the following day in the eviction round of the then series of Channel 4's Big Brother than participated in the election that returned me as a member of the European Parliament. So it's without any sense of false modesty that I address this society tonight. Actually, I've got to tell you, the way I got back in last time, I was very depressed at the last election because I could see the ballot papers piling up in the count. And people had scrawled next to my name, "Shove off back to Brussels." They used a stronger word than shove. And I thought, well, that's it. You know, the game is up. But I had an ingenious agent who went to the returning officer with a great sort of armful of these ballot papers and said, look, it is plainly the intention of all these voters to return Daniel Hannan to Brussels, and therefore all of these should be counted as votes in the Conservative interest. I'm sure that this society would never dream of conducting its own elections along such principles. Let's go back to the motion. Greater integration can make Europe strong. Well, let's ask what made Europe strong in the first place. Allow me to posit tonight, ladies and gentlemen, that the secret success of European civilization, the thing that raised European culture to its magnitude, was, on the contrary, diversity, variety, pluralism, and above all, democracy. That unique discovery of our fathers that people who make laws should be accountable to everybody else. Let me illustrate that with a little thought experiment. Join me if you will. Imagine that you were an alien circling the planet Earth in a flying saucer some 500 years ago, gazing down at the civilizations then existent on our planet. It seems to me that if you were a betting sort of an alien, your money would have been on the triumph of the Orient. You'd have seen the enormous achievements of the Ming and the Mughal and the Ottoman empires. You'd have seen their cartography, their mathematics, their architecture, their canals, their paper money, their systems of tax and administration. And then your eye would have alighted briefly on these broken, squabbling tribes at the westernmost tip of the Eurasian landmass, and you would have assumed that all of the future was Eastern. You'd have assumed that it would have been the Chinese sailing round Africa and discovering Portugal, rather than the other way around. These are, I admit, not original arguments of mine. They're due to an Australian historian called E.L. Jones, but they were taken to a much wider audience in Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. What was it? What was the secret of Europe's success? What was it that fostered this sense of adventurism and enterprise in our people that made ours the predominant civilization of those 500 years? It seems to me that it was precisely that we never became a single centralized empire in Europe. That rather than being a state, we were a competing state system, where there was rivalry and competition, where people could pilot new ideas and trial things and copy that which was most successful in their neighbours. By all means.
Would you not say that there was a certain human cost to all this competition?
Well, there was a human cost in all of this, yes. I'll let you into a little secret. It's not the first time I've said this, and that's always the point of information I get at this stage, and I always give the same answer to it, which is this. At that stage, of course, in China, in India, there was war was, in those days, a way of settling disputes. It happened just as much within the imperial as within the dispersed and democratic system. What was different about Europe was that because people were able to copy what worked best, because there was no uniformity, no centralized, heavily taxed bureaucratic system, we had a system that was favorable and smiled on new technology and new invention. And here is my worry. That just at the moment that China and India and the rest of the world has discovered the merits of devolution of power, of freedom, of enterprise, of free trade, Europe is going in the opposite direction. Europe is going down that Ming, Mughal, Ottoman path towards higher taxes, more rules, more centralization, and the concentration of power in the hands of a small elite chosen not on the basis of popular approval, but rather on the basis of their signing up to a given ideology. It's no coincidence that Eurocrats are known as mandarins. They're chosen in a rather similar way. And so if you ask me, what's the way to make Europe stronger? I wouldn't say that it's more of that integration, more of that centralization. You know what would make Europe stronger? More democracy. Listening to people. Now, you might think that I'm making rather an outrageous claim if I say that the European Union is undemocratic. It is, after all, an association of 27 parliamentary states. But I do make that claim. And allow me to present in support of it Exhibit A. How does the European Union respond when people vote in a way which it disapproves of? Lord Tomlinson hymned the virtues of this European Constitution Lisbon Treaty. But he omitted to mention the inconvenient fact that that document is rejected almost every time people are asked. 55% of French voters, 62% of Dutch voters, 54% of Irish voters voted no. And what was the response in Brussels? I'll take you in a moment, my lord. What was the response? Not literally, I mean, I'll take your point. What was the response in Brussels to those referendum results? It was to toss them aside. It was to carry on anyway. Barely, the Irish referendum hadn't even had its results formally declared when Barroso stood up and announced that the no vote wouldn't solve anything, and therefore ratification was going to proceed in every other country. I'm reminded of those eerie words of Bertolt Brecht. Wouldn't it therefore be easier to dissolve the people and elect another in their place? Yes, my lord.
Mr. Hannan, it would take more than you even having 3 Weetabixes for breakfast to take me. But let me just point out to you that the 3 things that were rejected, 2 of them, the rejections, France and Holland, were of the draft constitution. That was withdrawn. There was only 1 rejection in relation to the amending treaty.
All right. Well, do you know, I don't think even you really believe that. I could see smoke billowing from your pants as you rose to tell me that. But you know what? Even if we play along with you, my lord, even if we play along with you, then 100% of the referendums on your version have gone for a no vote, and yet the European Union has decided to disregard that result and carry on as if it were a vote in favour. Now, why is it? Why is it that these 27 countries, which are individually democratic and individually respect the rule of law, why is it that collectively they lose that virtue and they become convinced of the rectitude of their ruling ideology over and above the preference of their constituent peoples? You know, people talk about the democratic deficit of the European Union as though it's some accident, as though it's some side effect, something that we could easily correct, a little design flaw that we can fix. But that profoundly misunderstands the nature of the project. The European Union was founded in an age when, for perfectly honourable reasons, the early patriarchs, the people who put it together in the 1950s, were convinced that full democracy had been a mistake. It had led in their eyes to fascism and to war, and therefore it had to be contained, or at least tempered, by a class of sober and measured functionaries. And the result of that is that when Monnet and Schuman put together this scheme, they understood, they knew from the first, that this bold, audacious project, this scheme to merge together the ancient republics and kingdoms of Europe into a polity, would not survive if it had to be repeatedly referred back to the constituent peoples for electoral permission. And so they deliberately vested supreme power in the hands of unelected commissioners who were made invulnerable to the ballot. Actually, I was just about to say that the European Commission is undemocratic because its members are not elected. It strikes me as I talk to you that it's actually worse than that. Uniquely in the Western world, the European Commission contrives to be anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you were appointed to it. So it's only when, like Chris Patten or Neill or Peter Mandelson, it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and legislate for them. Ladies and gentlemen, bear in mind what we're really talking about here. Democracy. The idea that lawmakers should be gathered together in an elected representative assembly was our greatest export, our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind. Our ancestors carried the seeds of that idea to far continents where it found fertile soil. But here, in the mother continent, the ancestral vine is withering. Having spent 300 years establishing the principle that lawmakers should be accountable downwards to their peoples rather than upwards to monarchical or ecclesiastical authorities, we are now losing sight of that in the name of this project of European integration. Well, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, you at least don't have to go along with this. You at least have a free vote at the end of this evening. Think before going through one door or the other. Think about how much of a price was paid to establish a system where people in power have repeatedly to go back and ask for reapproval from everybody else. Democracy is our most precious possession. Don't toss it idly away.
to the floor debate, and Charles for members of the audience to have their say. Can I just ask speakers to keep contributions short and snappy, and to remember to give your name and college before you speak. Do we have first any speeches in favour of the motion tonight?
I'd like to say, sorry, I'm Ben Lewis from St Catherine's College. I'd like to say that I agree with Mr. Hassan absolutely everything except his conclusion. I think the lessons he draws from history are very erroneous, and that him and his colleague choose examples that are deliberately designed to conflate socialism with integration. The two are not the same, and never will be the same, hopefully. Integration has had markedly positive results in history. Look at the German Republic, which was once a series of federal states, and in 1861 was united by Otto von Bismarck and was able to take over, essentially, the Republic of France. If we look at the United States, which after great unification instituted federal institutions under Roosevelt, was able to become the prominent democracy, prominent economy in the Western world, I think the lesson of integration is that it is a positive thing, especially when it's used in conjunction with liberal democracy. So I commend the motion.
Can we hear a speech in opposition to the motion? Yep. The lady back.
Charles from London Neill College. The first speaker for the proposition started off by saying it was all optimal governance. Well, that's not the case, because the technical constitution lets the Commission reserve the right to take power in any area it sees fit. And another point that I would like to rebut that's been made by the proposition is that somehow the Commission is carrying out our wishes with our policies. The example was given of the foreign aid policy, where you said that there was an enormous budget of aid being spent. Well, an enormous budget being spent does not mean that it's being spent well. The Commission's accounts have not been signed off for over a decade, certainly. So, if it's all getting wasted, then that surely detracts from the economic strength of the countries that could use the money. So, for those reasons, and many more have already been covered by the opposition, I'm voting for the opposition.
Do we have any speakers in abstention of the motion?
Yes, Gabriela, how are you? From Clare Hall. As a proud representative of Eastern European people, Romanians, Bulgarians, and yes, Albanians, and why not Kosovars while we're at it also, I would like to actually make 2 points. I do agree with Mr. Hammond's point that indeed we need more democratic procedures, we need to listen to each other more, and I'm really baffled by how Mr. Knappman has this totally undemocratic attitude of not listening to Eastern Europeans, which are not capable of debating in European institutions. And actually, I want to make 2 points here. I'd like to counteract this point that we are capable, actually, as Eastern Europeans, which don't have this democratic tradition, have a perfectly socialist tradition of communism for 50 years, to debate and to support our point. And secondly, I'd like to show why we're really willing to integrate and why we know that EU integration is not Russian socialism and central command. So first of all, I'll tell you why we are capable of debating. First, let me remind you that you actually don't even have faith in your own House of Lords to actually debate amendments and proceed to passing them. So what can I say? If you don't have faith in your own position, what do you expect for us? But second of all, let me tell you that just because we don't have a tradition of debating, this does not mean that we are not there at the European Parliament session trying to get laws passed, trying to debate, trying to further our cause, and trying to learn more. Whoever thought in 1970s that Ireland would pull out once from its conflict and its civil strife and progress due to the European chance that it had in the 1990s and its economic chance? We believe that if Ireland had a chance, we can also have a chance. And we're there giving our best and trying our best to make this happen, even with our socialist tradition. And second of all, let me show you why we are willing to
wrap up.
Yes, I will. Sorry. Actually, we recognize that European integration is not European decisions on foreign policy decisions, for example. And we appreciated that in 2004 we could send troops to Iraq, and well, I'm not agreeing with the decision, but we could do it, and that didn't condition our entrance in 2007 in the EU. So let me tell you that we do know that we're not getting into a central commando, and we are appreciating what EU is giving us. Thank you.
Thank you. Lawrence Sterling from Neill College. I haven't heard a single argument, a proper argument from the opposition this evening, only propagandist rabble-rousing and very dodgy history. As for the rabble-rousing, a lot of the arguments you put forward were simply wrong. For instance, your last argument that there's a deficit of democracy in the European Union. That seems to be a recurrent theme. You said that the achievement of European history is that lawmakers should be accountable to the people. And then you went on to say that the Commission was not democratically elected. Quite the opposite. The Commission is not the lawmaking body of the European Union.
It has a monopoly on the right to initiate law.
The European Commission can propose motions which are then voted on in the European Parliament, which is elected by the people, as well as the European Council, which is a body of European governments, again elected by their respective peoples. So you have very clear democratic characteristics here. Then, as for the other bit, the very dodgy history making, rewriting here, the whole bit about former empires, the Ottomans and the Chinese being overtaken by squabbling barbarians. You see, the fact is that today we have an unprecedented amount of global interconnection. Issues have planetary impact, not just regional ones. So the fact that squabbling barbarians might have come up with appropriate forms of leadership at that time is a totally different matter. We've got a totally unprecedented situation which needs a new form of government, or governance rather, a global one, as has been pointed out at several points.
Just to wrap up, please.
Okay, on a final note, the word of subsidiarity has not been mentioned yet. I think that the way Europe functions on the basis of subsidiarity, which means cooperation where it makes sense, such as financial crisis or global warming, but separate legislations where it makes sense. Obviously, Brussels is not going to discuss the building of, say, a kindergarten or a playground in Cambridge. That's going to be a local matter. So you've got subsidiarity, and that is the appropriate form of government for a global world today. So, vote the proposition. Thank you.
Scale back its horizon. Europe must devote itself to promoting free immigration and free trade. We should scrap the cap, and we should make all further political integration voluntary. Thank you.
And other speeches is abstention.
Hi, Sergey, Darwin College. I want to comment very briefly on the democratic deficit point. The reason why people vote against Lisbon Treaty is because they claim they don't understand it. The reason why Lisbon Treaty is complicated is because 27 governments came to it with their the interest of not surrendering an iota of their national sovereignty. And that was the result of the compromise that they produced. The reason why nobody gives the European Parliament any power, and that's why the European Union is accused of democratic deficit, is because national parliaments do not want to surrender the legitimacy that democratic election confers against them. Consequently, the way to solve the problem of the democratic deficit in the European Union is a closer integration and a more democratically elected Central European Union bodies. We cannot solve the democratic deficit in the European Union by somehow devolving it any further. And finally, I just want to make a point. Why do you think the fiercest critics of the European Union are inevitably based in the European Parliament?
I came to this debate with an open mind, but I'm speaking in favour of the proposition. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, Mr. Hanan, you said it was about democratic legitimacy. I do not understand how it can be legitimate if 54% of Irish voters have rejected the treaty. That is less than 1% of European voters. With regards to Mr. Natman, you said that Eastern European governments could not be trusted almost to be part of the EU because of their history in the USSR. One too many S's there, my apologies. However, if there is no integration, I sense there is a real risk that we will go back to that stage, and it is on that basis that I commend the motion.
Charles Rees from Wolston College. Lord Tomlinson talks about pooling sovereignty. I say surrendering sovereignty. Perhaps he could explain the difference.
It's a matter of simple fact. That is exactly what we do. And the difference is that I'm right and you're wrong.
The gentleman with the cap.
Neill, Trinity College. I'd just like to make a sort of verbal analogy here that strong government is often used as a euphemism for weak political freedoms. For example, the strong government that Putin is building in Russia, or the strong government that the Germans liked in the 1930s, and so on. So I'm just wondering, does European integration give us the lowest common denominator of political freedom, human rights, and so on, or does it give us the highest common denominator? Thank you.
Thank Richard very much for his contribution and all the floor speakers tonight. I'm sorry we didn't have time to hear all of you, but we have to move on. And the next speaker in favour of the motion tonight is the Chair of the Centre for Energy Studies and Director of the Centre for European Reform. Very pleased to welcome Nick Hutt.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I think the overwhelming tone of the evening is one of nostalgia. I thought when we walked in and I looked at the two front benches here, that you had taken this union back 50 years to the point where women were seen but not heard. Two front benches and no women speakers. I'm delighted that we had more women speaking during the floor debate. Then, of course, there's a degree of nostalgia about the jokes that Mr. Hannan quoted, and some of them were just so old they qualify for a winter heating payment. And then there's an overwhelming degree of nostalgia about the arguments. I can remember sitting in this chamber more than 30 years ago, and Mr. Hannan did remind me of this, listening to Enoch Powell in a debate on a very similar motion about whether Britain should, at that point, join the European Union. And he was very emotional. He's a wonderful speaker, just like Mr. Hannan. You're a long way to go. And he really carried the audience with him, and it was the same argument. This creation of a superstate power moving away, the loss of freedom, our democracy being eroded. And of course then, because he was Enoch Powell, he couldn't resist taking it just one step further and talking about how if we weren't careful, we would be flooded in this country, not just with immigrants from the Commonwealth, but also once the European Union, the economic community had developed, with people from right across Europe who would come here and destroy our culture. And he was carrying the audience with him until a very good friend of mine, who's sitting over there, got up on a point of information and put on a very plummy public school voice and said, "Very great point, Mr. Powell. Don't you think we should send that gang of Germans and Greeks that have taken over Buckingham Palace back where they belong?" This is a serious debate, though, and I want to focus on the serious points. And I think we should start by saying that there is great respect across the floor for the different opinions. These are real arguments. This is not, we can have a laugh, but it's not true. I absolutely dissociate myself, as I'm sure Mr. Hannan does, from David Cameron's description of UKIP members as fruitcakes, lunatics, and closet racists. And I think we no doubt dissociate ourselves from his further private qualification of that, where he said he wished he hadn't said it, and he wished he'd left out the word closet. I don't agree with this. I think that these are people with a view. I don't agree with the view, of course. I think they're honourable men. They're a party of their time. The only problem is that the time is the 1890s. A time of P.G. Wodehouse and Kipling and Elgar, of splendid isolation where Britain can just operate on its own and ignore and just let the rest of the world go by.
On a point of information.
If you read later,
on that very point.
later
All right.
there are two main policies on the UKIP website. They commit to increasing defence spending by 40% and by freezing immigration for at least 5 years. So that would end the flow of foreign students, no doubt, into this country and into this university. No. Well, there's nothing else on universities on the website. There's no other policy.
Education paper. That's where you find
But really, there's just one policy, and that is to come out of Europe, because that stands in the way of everything else. Now, I don't question the honesty...
On a point of... I'm sorry, you obviously are. You're very cleverly pretending not to question our motives. Let me say, this has nothing to do with nostalgia. You're arguing against something that nobody is proposing. I speak French, I speak Spanish, I wrote for a German newspaper for 2 years, I've lived and worked all over the continent. My problem with this, and I think this is typical of our side, is not that it involves collaboration among countries. You'd have to be mad to be against that. My problem with it is that it's remote, it's undemocratic, and 84% of the laws, according to the German government, 84% of the legislation in the member states is passed by people that nobody votes for.
Well, you're a very clever debater, Ms. Hannan, and you do it for a living and I don't. But I think that the argument on that side of the House is that Britain can stand alone without being part of Europe.
Would they, gentlemen, what has this got to do with the motion tonight?
Well, if you weren't interrupting me, I'd get to it. I'm going to focus on not just Europe's interest, but what Britain's interest is. And I do so from a point of patriotism. I think integration, and greater integration, is necessary to deal with the big issues of our time. Financial instability, a resurgent Russia, terrorism, climate change. Can we really say that those issues are going to be managed just by Britain on its own, or that Britain can in any way stand aside from those issues they'll happen in the rest of the world and they won't happen to us. I don't think so. We don't argue that Europe is the only foreign policy relationship that this country should have. We need to be integrated into many other institutions as well. We don't argue that Europe is perfect or that everything is right there at the moment. There needs to be great reform, but reform to me comes through engagement and integration, not through distancing ourselves from a project which is still a work in progress. And I personally don't want to distance myself from the idea that people should have a vote. I think these are important issues. I see no harm in having a vote. I hope we will have a vote at a general election, but I think if we're going to have serious European policies on these big issues, as I believe we need to, we should have a vote. It matters to have, and I agree with you on this, the democratic will behind what is being done in the name of the people. The reform that Europe needs does come through integration, but it is not total and general integration. It is integration where Europe can do something in the world for the greater good. That is many of the issues I've mentioned, but it is not everything. We are not talking about a super-state. It is integration where it makes sense and not integration where that makes sense. And really, this debate has focused on Europe, but you should think before you vote about what the alternatives are. I believe the alternatives to creative, reformist integration are either isolation, where we as a country have no ability to influence the world on these big issues, or, even more dangerous and even more negative, a complete reliance on the United States as the leader of world policy. I don't want to go in either direction. Nostalgia is always tempting. It is always tempting to think back to a world we've lost, but it's wrong. The world is more complicated now, and we have to be within that world, working within it, integrating where it makes sense. I urge you to vote for the motion. Thank you.
Thank Nick very much indeed for his speech. And to continue the case for the opposition tonight, very pleased to welcome the Deputy Leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, Mr. David Campbell-Bannerman.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to speak tonight here. Can I just respond to what the opposition, our opposition, said? First, Lord Tomlinson, you really should speak to the most senior Labour MEP because he disagrees with you about the superstate. This is from his book. It says, let's stop defending, pretending and apologising. A socialist superstate is exactly what we want to create. You really should have a word with him. Maybe send Mandelson over there.
Yes, but all parties have their mavericks, yours included.
He's not a maverick. He's very central. The second point, Charles was talking about the grand security defence force. I was just wondering if they might adopt the policy of the German troops, the German army in Afghanistan, who don't fight at night. And I wondered whether, as long as our enemies don't come at night, we might be safe under your proposals. The third point about racism, and it's very unfair, I think, to tar UKIP with racism. We're not racist. We're a non-racist, non-sectarian party. We do love our country. We're open to every ethnic group. We have ethnic candidates. We have the former chief accountant of the European Union standing as one of our MEP candidates. And my God, will she create merry hell over there when she gets there. And she is Spanish. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you said also about racism, are the Norwegians and the Swiss racist for not being in the European Union? They actually, coincidentally, they're the two richest countries per head in Europe. I think they got something right that we're getting wrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, this grand praise we're getting from this side of the argument reminds me of a distinguished Cambridge graduate, John Cleese, when he talks about what have the Romans ever done for us? And I have to ask the question, what has the EU ever done for us? Because this is what the debate has boiled down to, this integrationist model. And let's just look at some of the arguments. There aren't many, but let's look at a few of them. Firstly, peace. Well, the claim that the EU ensures peace in Europe. Well, no one wants war in Europe. I was at the Somme this year. It's a terrible place to be, very sobering. I've been at Pegasus Bridge at the 50th anniversary of D-Day and the Normandy landing. I know how terrible European wars are, and we don't want war either. But peace depends on respect between nations and respect for democracy, identity, difference and self-determination, none of which the EU respects. It is a rigid, inflexible, unaccountable autocratic superstate that's accounts haven't been signed off the last 14 years in a row. Now, please.
Doesn't peace also depend on cooperation and integration?
Yes, we're all for cooperation. But, we do cooperate with the rest of the world, and without going to war with them. It is not the EU that has delivered our peace, it is democracy and NATO. And the EU threatens both of those things. Indeed, the German President Herzog has said that with 84% of laws now coming to Germany from the EU, and only 16% from Berlin, that he says, quote, "It raises the question of whether one can unreservedly call the Federal Republic a parliamentary democracy at all." I think it is deeply worrying. The last time democracy failed in Germany, they elected Hitler to replace it. And we have done a lot to implant democracy in Germany, and it has actually been put at risk by the EU superstate. Trade, second argument, trade. Well, we're told we have to be in Europe because half of our exports go to the EU. Well, half of our exports is only 10% of the economy, and actually it's not true it's half of our exports. We now, as of last year, export more to the rest of the world, and if you look at global vision, by 2015, two-thirds of our exports will be the rest of the world. And has the EU trade really benefited our country? If we look at the actual figures, when we joined the European community, we had a small surplus with the EEC. Within a year, that became £2.6 billion deficit. It's now £40 billion deficit with the EU. We are the EU's largest single trading partner, and if we were to leave the EU, we could have an excellent free trade agreement like Norway and Switzerland do. And do you think that the French will stop selling us their wine, or the Germans their machinery, or the Italians cars? Of course not. We could be like Norway and Switzerland. And as for this nonsense that we'll lose 3 million jobs, well, the 3 million jobs equates to the trade. Well, if there is a trade war, and of course there wouldn't be a trade war, there's 4.5 million EU jobs that depend on exporting to Britain. So there's no one's interest to have a trade war. We just need a trade agreement. We need free trade and nothing to do with this political superstate.
Take a point from So yes, you said you want to be like Norway, but as I'm sure you're aware, Norway is in the European Economic Area. They take all the rules of the EU single market, but don't have a vote on them. Is that the situation you want for Britain?
Well, no, they don't. Actually, they don't. They don't. I mean, the fact is, Norway, well, when they're exporting to the EU, I mean, obviously, the 10% would have to follow EU regulations. Absolutely right. 10% of our economy that exports to the EU. That's entirely true. Norway has a £200 billion sovereign wealth fund. Norway's all right. You know, these are very wealthy countries. We are actually, it's costing us £50 billion a year, including red tape, to be a member of the European Union. And there's 120,000 regulation directive imposed upon us because of being a member of the EU. We're not anti-Europe. We just want a free trade agreement, which is all the British people ever gave permission for in that 1975 referendum. And as we saw from the David Martin quote, their ambition here is to create a superstate, but to do so through stealth. And that is anti-democratic and very dangerous. What about the right to work? That's just a couple of other points about the EU. Well, you're right, under the European Economic Area, indeed, Norwegians can work in the UK, we could have the same arrangement and not lose any right to work around the EU. So there's no loss there with a free trade agreement. What about global warming? Well, sorry, I've got to push on. What about global warming? Well, one of our great members is Sir Patrick Moore, astrologer, studied the planets for 50 years. He likes to point out, yes, the polar caps are melting on Earth, but they're also melting on Mars and Venus, and I'm not sure how many 4x4s are being driven by Martians, but we do doubt this global warming. But it's a wonderful excuse to override national governments once more.
Behind you.
Two other. Sorry, I've got to press on. Two other. It's not a Martian, is it? Sorry. Two other points. Regional aid. Regional aid. We think that's wonderful, but for every £2.80 we send to Brussels, we only get £1 back. And when we get the £1 back, if we get the £1 back, we have additionality clauses. It means we have to put yet more money in to make up for that. We are paying now, because of the euro going up, 10 billion net cash contribution to the EU every year. And finally, another benefit, consumer benefits. They do claim credit for cheap flights abroad in Europe, but that has nothing to do with the EU. In fact, you only have to ask the boss of Ryanair what he thinks of Brussels, and the reply is unrepeatable and unprintable. That is down to market liberalisation. But, ladies and gentlemen, for all of those supposed benefits, we are paying a massive cost, and it's interfering in our democracy and our way of life and our constitution. Yes, let's trade happily and freely with Europe. Let's have friendly relations like Norway and Switzerland do. But let's do it on a different basis. And that, I think, the independence model is far more attractive than this EU integrationist model. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed. The final speaker on proposition tonight is a French deputy and former minister. Very pleased to welcome Hervé Weisman.
Mr. President, thank you for your invitation. I believe the strength of our cause lies in the variety of arguments we can share to support it, whereas I heard mostly the same arguments from the part of the opposition. I believe that it is necessary for us to build a greater integration in Europe, because it is for the better of Europe and for the best of our countries. We do not defend greater integration for the greater integration and not for the pleasure of a new and complex architecture, but because we believe it gives good results and it is better for the future of our people. We must not deny that Europe today is made of many difficulties. We are conscious of these difficulties, and things don't go right. The organization of Europe is too complex and ununderstandable to many. The institutions do not work in proper way, and indeed sometimes Europe seems to have most of the defects that our own bureaucracies have. We often criticize our bureaucracy in France, and it seems that the European red tape is often even less understandable than ours. And so we come to referendums where people in France, in the Netherlands, in Ireland vote no. Do they vote no because they've not understood what Europe is about? I believe that the people is sovereign, that they are never mistaken, and obviously you can't dissolve the people. So the right answer is not to feed the people as you feed geese to make foie gras, but is to rearrange the system, reframe our policies, and make greater integration a better integration. Not greater in the frame that it has to be more complex, more compulsory, more constraining, but the fact that greater has to do with a greater project. I believe that if we want to improve the way Europe goes and the way it's understood by the people, the way it's effective, it's not telling people they're wrong, it is wondering as politicians how we can make things better. I think we have to draw a more integrated Europe, not alongside the lines we've known in the past decades. We have to build greater integration on a new framework. We have to build a greater integrated Europe and a new Europe. First, I think we have to work harder, to share better, and to enhance the common values of Europe. It has been said about our relation with Russia, for example. I believe our relation with Russia would be stronger to the best interest of Europe and to the best interest of Russia if we were more expressive in the support to the traditional values of Europe. The idea of democracy, the tradition of enlightenment, all that may be supposed as basics for Europe and may be forgotten in the way we live and build Europe today. I believe this is a mistake. For the insiders of Europe and for the outsiders, when we speak to Russia, when we speak to China, saying what Europe is about is important. But we can say that with efficiency only if we live in an integrated enough system. Otherwise, we can't have an expressive and understandable message. So I believe a greater integrated Europe is first greater strength in expressing our values, and second point, a rearrangement of our policies that would have to do with what I call substantial technicalities. I believe the level of integration so far is not the good one. Greater integration is not doing more on all fields. It's not working on minor subjects where French believe that selling goat cheese and enjoying goat cheese in France is getting more and more complex. But we do need greater integration on important technical subjects if we want the flow of exchange of goods and of people to be what it should be in our civilization and to contribute to better lives for everybody. The principle of subsidiarity is not enough to build a better Europe. The experience is not that convincing, and I believe it is an interesting principle of philosophy, but not quite the best to build an understandable political system. So Europe is about values. It's about a stronger and denser cooperation on justifiable fields. It is also cooperation on fields where it is efficient and where the question of size is relevant. This is not necessarily from a European bureaucracy as such. And so I believe that there are levels where there can be some sort of confederal Europe, federal Europe. Values are shared and technicalities have to be managed. But there are other fields which are more on a multilateral ground, be it on defence, for example, where a lot has to be done. Also the question of currency. Actually, the British may say that they can live at ease with the pound, but in the present financial circumstance, the pound is manageable in Britain only because there exists in Europe such thing as the euro. Greater integration, as I said, is, in my meaning, a better integration which is necessary for our countries. And the goal is not easy to attain. So I will not tell you that greater integration has to be attained too quickly. The matter is so difficult that I think it would be wise to pause for a certain period and in a certain way. Some emergencies have to be dealt with. The present financial crisis, the reforms we have to enact concerning our financial governance. But I believe that our policies have so much to be changed so that greater means greater attention to the people, greater pertinence to the...
That's not what happened. When, for example, after the French elections, Giscard wrote that famous article in Le Monde where he tried to smear the people who had voted no by making comparisons about the relative educational levels, for example, of the people who had voted no. Well, that's not the way to go about it. Smearing the people instead of listening to them. So that has to be dealt with first.
As you've probably heard, my name is Mariton and not Giscard. And so I was just saying that the people is always right, but I do not believe that progress can be made in restraint. I think it can be made in better progress. And as I said, I think we have to pause, we have to discuss, we have to reframe many of our policies, but not with the idea that we've got to do less, with the idea that we've got to do better and that we've got to do more efficient. That is sound greater integration, and it will be judged and decided by the people by the Euro election in 2009.
Monsieur Mariton very much indeed for his remarks, and to close the case for the opposition today, I'm very pleased to welcome the chair of the Cambridge University Conservative Association, Hugo.
Thank you, Mr. President. The motion, this House believes only greater integration can keep Europe strong, clearly means greater political integration. People sometimes say that we need an economic bloc to, say, counter the economic strength of America or Asia. This clearly misunderstands economics, which is not conducted, trade is not conducted by governments or blocs, but by individual people. The EU, of course, is an anti-free trade protectionist organisation, which we're not richer as a result of our membership of. It's a protectionist organisation which imposes tariffs on imports from outside it. It's a customs union, not a free trade area. So it's not economic strength the EU gives us. It's economic weakness. So let's have a look at political integration. Well, European Union political integration is not going to keep the people of Europe strong. My argument is going to be that it's going to keep the EU strong, but it's going to make the people of Europe weak. because it's an undemocratic institution, and I hope to explain this in greater detail. I'm going to be going through 3 points. One, that inherently democracy is impossible on such a large scale. You need a nation-state to have a democracy. Without a nation, you merely have a state, naked power. So it's impossible on such a large scale. I'm then going to say, in practice, the EU is an inherently inbuilt anti-democratic organisation. Its structures are designed to be undemocratic. And finally, I'm going to say that the natural outcome of its anti-democratic tendencies will be totalitarianism, and this is starting now, and I shall give some examples. John Tomlinson, Lord Tomlinson, the noble lord, said, well, he started counter-arguments from our side before we had even made them. He never actually...
But you didn't let me down.
He never actually proposed any useful things the EU does itself. He talked about aid, which of course, the EU's aid money is merely the sum of the aid money of its member states. He didn't talk about the common agricultural policy, or the common fisheries policy, or everything bad the EU does. He didn't talk about its protectionism. He said that the EU was merely pooling our sovereignty. He claimed it was not creating a superstate. Well, I'd like to ask, what is the difference between pooling our sovereignty and creating a state? 80% of the laws in the UK are now made by the EU, undemocratically. It only has the power we give them. But who are we? The EU hasn't, in none of its procedures since the 70s, we haven't had a referendum since the 70s. The EU treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, is going to be implemented without a referendum. In fact, one of the floor speakers said that it was only rejected by 1% of the electorate. Well, it was rejected by the electorate that was given a vote. The EU treaty, it's being implemented already, actually. They know that it's being rejected. They're not going to ask us for another... no, not just yet. They're not going to ask us another time. They're not going to ask us in the UK at all. All these structures, all the institutions that it describes, most of them have been implemented already. They have no legal force. But they don't care in the EU. They don't care. They're going to implement the rest of it anyway. So, let's see. 1. Democracy is impossible on a large scale. Well, not just it. Start again? Can you start again? Sorry.
The USA seems to exist as a rather large democratic entity.
This is true. Yes, one of the other floor speakers made the same point about the US federal system. Of course, the US federal system is a democratic federal system. I shall come on to this as part of my speech. The EU is not. I won't bore you about Arrow's impossibility theorem or any formal mathematical reasons why you cannot have such a large democracy. The problem with the EU, a simple problem, is the tyranny of the majority. That's why we have the common agricultural policy. Why can't we get rid of it? That's why we have the common fisheries policy. Economists call this the tragedy of the commons, where one nation's fishing waters might get completely overfished because it's in the interests of the other nations to overfish them. It's not in the long-term interests of the environment. No, thank you. The EU is, it's one size fits all. For example, one way we could integrate more would be by joining the euro, which would mean we would then have to accept a single exchange rate for the whole of Europe, which of course cannot actually be specific to any particular country. It will always either be too high or too low. So each country can be strong with different interest rates. That would be one way by which the EU would harm each country economically and not benefit anyway. So okay, that's it. Democracy is impossible, but on a large scale. The EU itself,
like in India,
is an undemocratic institution. It was designed to be. Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the EU, hated democracy. He thought that it was responsible for war. He preferred a bureaucracy, a rule of bureaucrats. He believed that civil servants were superior. And the EU has therefore been constructed to give power to unelected civil servants. Let me explain. The European Parliament is the only elected body of the EU. It has no legislative initiative. It can't propose legislation. The unelected European Commission, the current one, is composed almost entirely of convicted criminals. No, I'm not joking. People with convictions of fraud, etc. Has legislative initiative. In fact, members of the Parliament can ask the Commission to propose legislation, but the Commission doesn't have to. So there's a chilling effect there, because you won't bother proposing legislation if you know that, that the Commission is going to reject it.
Just a small matter of fact. Would you take a matter of fact? You're saying the European Parliament is the only elected body. Would he not agree that in the areas where legislation is shared, where you have co-decision making, the other body is the Council of Ministers, all of which are represented their national parliaments, all of which are elected, and they are just as democratic as anybody else.
They're not elected directly by the people. Let's talk about the co-decision procedure. About a quarter of EU laws don't fall under the co-decision procedure. They fall under the assent procedure, which means the European Parliament has the power to veto but not amend proposals. And if they fall under the consultation procedure, the European Parliament cannot stop legislation. So, the European Commission, unelected, can propose legislation which no one can stop. It's designed to be undemocratic. It's deliberate. No, thank you. So finally, the natural outcome of the EU's anti-democratic design will be totalitarianism. I hope you don't think that I'm over-egging the issue. I hope to convince you otherwise. For example, current plans in place to censor the internet. They don't call it censoring the internet. Mikko Hahn is a European MEP, has proposed legislation successfully recently to regulate blogs for misleading people. This has nothing to do with consumer protection. That's not mentioned at all. Misleading people politically. They want to license all blogs. You won't be able to blog without a license. This is coming. Check it out. 2. Richard Corbett, MEP, recently proposed a motion to raise the number. No, thank you. Raise the number of MEPs required to form a European Parliament group, a party group in the European Parliament. You need to be in a party group to have a greater say in legislation. You get more time in speaking. You get funding. He wanted to raise the number of MEPs you needed to have a group. Why did he do this? Well, they wanted to exclude the smallest parliamentary group, the only Eurosceptic one. The worst reason to change a law is to target a particular group of people. But so much for the rule of law. This has happened. So, for all these reasons, I ask you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to pick up one or two questions of fact. First of all, I say to Mr. Knappman, you really ought to hang your head in shame for what you said about the people of Central and Eastern Europe who have joined the European Union. Countries like Poland that we entered the Second World War to defend, countries like the former Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, countries like Slovenia, like Hungary, like the Baltic states who were invaded by oppressive dictatorial regimes like the Russians, like the Soviet Union, forced into the Soviet Union.
That's what I said.
They are people who were historically democratic, and it was part of our responsibility to get them back into the democratic family of nations in exactly the same way as it was the European Union that supported Spain and Portugal and Greece in their return from fascist dictatorships. It's an enormous role of the European Union, of which we all ought to be proud, because it's helped secure the democratic framework of our continent of Europe. Just very briefly, and don't clap in between because we're short of time, there's three more points. First of all, several people have alluded to Commission accounts. I have to tell you that our Controller and Auditor General not somebody who has to go cap in hand to get permission from Brussels to do anything. Our Controller and Auditor General, in evidence that he produced to the British Parliament, said that if we were responsible for using the same accounting method, particularly the statement of assurance as they have in the European Union, he would have never had our reports allowed. They would have been qualified on every occasion. Thirdly, Ryanair, we were told nothing to do with the European Union. Nothing to do with the European Union. The boss of Ryanair said cheap flights are all to do with market liberalisation. Ask yourself, how the hell did that market liberalisation happen? It happened during the period when Neill was the Transport Commissioner, and that was the period of market liberalisation. And finally, what has the European Union done for us? It has created a stable Europe despite the economic upsets of recent weeks. It is a peaceful Europe, and it's one in which we tolerate even some of the nonsensical interventions which are based on fantasy rather than truth. Europe has defended our interest, it's secured our interest, and it's certainly done more to promote the secure democracy of our neighbour states by incorporating them than any of the rhetoric we've heard from others tonight.
And thank all of tonight's speakers for a fascinating debate this evening. The only thing left for me to do is draw your attention to a few of the events we have coming up later this week here at the Cambridge Union. We've got tomorrow, we've got Cam live music in the bar from 8 o'clock. We've got a film night on Saturday night, Train Spotting and Requiem for a Dream. On Monday night we have our pub quiz, special sponsored edition, first prize of £150, over 100. Over £100. On Tuesday night, we have, in association with the Cambridge University African Caribbean Society, we have a special forum under the title We Rule, Empowerment Through the Past, Progress Through the Future, with authors B. Bandele and Kwame Kwame. On Wednesday night, in association with the Cambridge University Students' Union, we have a forum on the future of higher education funding in the United Kingdom. And on Thursday night, we have our next debate, in which Germaine Greer will propose that Cambridge is institutionally sexist. Also, on regular opportunities for getting involved in the Union Society. If you want to learn debating, come along Tuesday evening from 7 o'clock. If you want to get involved in helping out, volunteering, come along to President's Committee from 5:15 here every Friday. Only leaves me now to ask the members of both sides to cross the floor and shake hands. If they dare.
We didn't agree tonight.
Results will be announced very shortly. I now ask the House to divide. Eyes to the right, nose to the left, abstentions down the middle. Thank you.